And now I have the pleasure of introducing the Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage, James Moore. And Minister Moore has truly shown great support for our industry and made a lot of really strong personal interventions to ensure that our Canadian movies and Canadian television shows and other content are showcased. And he's run an excellent series of film screenings in Ottawa, which has really in this town elevated people's appreciation of our film industry. And he's to be congratulated for that. And I think he really likes Canadian stuff, and that's great. He's a real busy guy. It's hard to pin him down because he's on the run, but he did find time today to be here with us and to share some thoughts with us. So without further ado, a true friend of our industry, Minister James Moore.
Well, thank you, Norm, for the very generous introduction. And thank you all very much for inviting me here today to speak with you. I haven't seen my iTouch yet. I don't know. Next year, iPads, maybe, if version 2 comes out and maybe CMPA can shift to iPads. But thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here. I know that CMPA and the Primetime Conference is really an annual event where people come together and really have a fantastic conversation and a great dialogue about Canadian content, Canadian culture, media, technology, where we're going, where we should be going, and all discussions in between. So I'm really pleased to be here on behalf of Prime Minister Stephen Harper and the federal government. And as a matter of fact, I want to talk about issues a little bit more broadly. This month marked the 5-year anniversary that Stephen Harper was elected as the Prime Minister of this country. So it seems only appropriate after 5 years to take a moment to look back at the 5 years of our government and to talk a little bit about arts, culture, and the creative economy and what it is that our government has done. So that's what I want to talk to you a bit about today. What has happened over the past 5 years, what we're doing today, and where we plan on going in the future. First, to be clear, the government of Prime Minister Stephen Harper is investing more money into arts, culture, and official languages than any government in Canadian history. We have tabled and passed 5 budgets in the Parliament of Canada, and in every one of our 5 budgets, we have increased funding for arts, culture, and official languages. And I just want to say that again. 5 budgets, and every single year, we have increased our funding for arts and culture. Why did we do that? Well, we did that for a bunch of reasons. Because, first of all, supporting Canadian culture and supporting Canadian creativity is supporting the Canadian economy. Arts and culture represents over 630,000 jobs in the Canadian economy. Canada's cultural industries combined constitute $46 billion in the Canadian economy, which is to say, in a different way, that Canada's cultural industries are larger than Canada's insurance industry and larger than Canada's forest industry combined. When we said in our economic action plan that we were going to be doing a great deal of investment into infrastructure, we weren't just talking about bridges and tunnels and rail crossings. We were also talking about cultural infrastructure. And our government has created 2 new national museums, the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 in Halifax and Canada's Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg. And on top of creating these 2 new national museums, we've also invested record amounts of new funding into the national museums that we have here in the national capital, including the new $240 million renovations at the Museum of Nature that was unveiled by Her Majesty the Queen when she visited here last summer. Our government has doubled cultural infrastructure spending, which has meant more money for more local and national cultural projects that are crucial to our cultural communities than ever before. The Théâtre du Nouveau Monde in Montréal has new upgraded equipment. The City of Barrie's new downtown community theatre is being built. The Imperial Theatre in St. John has been renovated. The Harbourfront Theatre in Summerside, PEI, renovations at the Massey Hall, the Roy Thompson Hall, the National Ballet in Toronto, as well as the Royal Conservatory of Music, all have renovations that are underway. The Quartier des Spectacles in Montreal has been built and is being used. It's the home of the Montreal Jazz Festival. The Fredericton's Beaverbrook Gallery, which is New Brunswick's official art gallery, has all new space. The Surrey Art Gallery, the Communauté Francophone of Cambridge and Ontario, all have been built and all have been put forward. These are critical pieces of infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure, we're also talking about not just productivity and moving people around faster, but building those cornerstones of cultural infrastructure that improve the quality of lives of everyday Canadians and communities across this country. And what good is all that infrastructure if you don't fill that infrastructure with the kind of events that make living so great in communities across this country? We're supporting, at record levels, celebrations, concerts, community events, and festivals all across this country. From large events like the Montreal Jazz Festival, Luminado, the Shaw Festival, the Edmonton Fringe Festival, the New Brunswick Summer Music Festival, and others, to small local events that add diversity and difference across this country, like the Miramichi Irish Festival, Jonquière Musique, the Northern Alberta International Children's Festival in St. Albert, the Medicine Hat Jazz Festival, and Port Moody's Golden Spike Days. These are events that enrich the quality of life in people and communities all across the country. They showcase Canadian talent, and they improve people's quality of lives in local economies. When the global recession hit, our government had a choice to make. We had difficult choices to make. We could do what other governments had done, especially governments in the G8 and the G20. We could do what other governments have done and look at arts and culture and say that's not necessary and we can cut that. But we decided not to do that. We're one of the only governments in all of the G20 that made a very different Canadian decision when it comes to arts and culture. We decided not to cut funding for arts and culture. We decided not to maintain the status quo. But against the trend of most governments in the world, we decided to invest more money into arts and culture at a time of recession. And we did that for some of the reasons that I described, but also because we wanted to stand up for communities, and also because we recognize that arts and cultural organizations in this country are held together sometimes with so much fragility that drop in government support is something that some of these organizations just can't stand. And I think that that is something that Canadians can't stand. We're proud of our infrastructure, we're proud of our cultural organizations, and we want governments that stand up and stand with cultural institutions and organizations because they do so much for us. And it's about what arts and culture does for us. I want to give you an example of that, a personal one that I know of very well. Ava Markport is a beautiful young British Columbian. She had a double lung transplant in 2007. It was needed because she was born with and struggled with cystic fibrosis all through her life, a debilitating genetic disease that often causes early death. The transplant was initially successful. It went well, in spite of what doctors thought originally, but it went well. But after about 2 years of living with her new transplanted lungs, her body began to reject them. On the 25th of March just last year, she was chronicling her illness and her recovery on her blog. And on March 25th of last year, she wrote, because she was having a particularly bad day, she said, I'm not managing at all. I'm drowning in the medications. I can't breathe. Every hour, once an hour, I can't breathe. Something has to change. 6 days later, she died. She was 25. Last Friday, a group of Eva's friends and her family wanted to raise some money for cystic fibrosis. And they wanted to also raise awareness of the importance of organ transplantation. And so what did they do? They put on a concert at the Massey Hall, in the Massey Theatre in New Westminster, British Columbia, in her honor. They asked artists to help, and they did. Vancouver artists Dan Mangan, the Zolas, Hannah Georges, Karina, they performed. They volunteered their time. They didn't get paid. All the proceeds went to charity. All the proceeds went to charity in Ava's name. They gave to a great cause because they were asked. And I tell this story because Canadian artists do this all the time, both for the benefit of Canadians and for those abroad, like when Bob Ezrin and Kanon produced The Young Artists for Haiti to raise money after the devastation of Haiti's earthquake last year, or when Rick Mercer hosted the Hope Live here in Ottawa twice. He paid all of his own expenses, came here to Ottawa, and hosted 2 fundraisers to raise money for women struggling to bear children after having gone through the often devastating treatments that go along with cancer treatment. A friend called, he answered, and he gave. Whether we've had floods or droughts, international disasters, earthquakes, fighting against cancer and other diseases, or in response to personal tragedies like Ava's, it has always been Canadian artists and Canada's cultural communities who stand up first. They rally us together. They're our collective voice. They articulate our sorrow, and often they turn our efforts and our energies towards something positive in return. Artists also, by the way, they inspire us all the time. It was a year ago this past week that we had the opening of the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. And when Nikki Yanofsky stood up and sang, I Believe, Canadians from all across the country were incredibly proud. And when Katie Lang sang Hallelujah at the opening ceremonies of the Olympic Games, the whole world wowed at what a remarkable talent that we had in Katie Lang here in Canada. Artists have done so much for Canada, and that's why Canadians hold artists in such high esteem. Not long ago, the CBC did a survey of the greatest Canadians ever. They ranked the 100 greatest Canadians ever. Out of the top 100 greatest Canadians of all time, 36 were artists. People like Mordecai Ritzler and Glenn Gould and Emily Carr. 17, by the way, were athletes. So we need to support our artists. Canadians already do. We're very proud of our artists and our cultural communities. And this is why I believe deeply that governments have to do everything that they can to support our creative communities. And that's why our government has reacted and done the things that we've done. For example, one of the first things we did as a government is we permanently increased funding for the Canada Council for the Arts by 20%, the largest increase that a government has ever given to the Canada Council since they were created. It's also why we renewed all of our government's programs and funding for arts and culture. The Canada Music Fund, we consulted artists, improved the program, and we renewed it for 5 years. The Canada Book Fund, we consulted authors. We listened, improved the program, we renewed it for 5 years. The Canada Periodical Fund, we consulted with writers and publishers. We fixed the program, and we renewed it for 5 years. Notre programme pour la dualité linguistique du Canada, notre feuille de route pour la dualité linguistique, pour supporter les organismes francophones, anglophones dans une situation minoritaire autour du Canada, nous avons investi 1,1 milliard de dollars sur 5 ans, une somme sans précédent dans l'histoire du Canada pour protéger la fée francophone et la fée anglophone dans chaque coin de ce pays. In supporting all of these programs, by investing in our creative communities the way that we have sent a clear message that we support creative communities and what they do for Canada's economy and for our quality of life. And it's been recognized. When Heather Ostertag was joining me in one of our press conferences for when we announced our 5-year funding envelopes for all of these funds, by the way, and we decided to renew them for 5 years in the middle of a recession. Again, as I said, when other governments around the world, other levels of government were cutting back on arts and culture funding, we decided to renew these for 5 years to say to all of our cultural organizations across this country, I know you're facing tough times, but you do not have to worry about Ottawa ever backing away from our commitment to our cultural communities. And in the face of the news of this, here's what Heather Ostertag said. She said, what is provided to Canadian artists by the Government of Canada is the envy of the world. And I say that because when somebody says that, you have to think back and say, my God, we have come a long way. And in Canada, we have come an incredibly long way. I'll give you some numbers to talk about that, or to reflect on that. Because gone is the era when arts and culture were not understood. They were not understood for the role that they play in nation building and community building, inspiring kids, building the economy, and in creating innovation and having those synapses fire in the heads of kids so that they can be part of the information age. That's where it starts, by the way. That's where it starts. You don't hand a child an iPad or a playbook and all of a sudden they get the information age. It starts when they're this high, when they get exposed to literature, when they go to museums, when they go to galleries, when they hear music that maybe their parents didn't expose them to, and they see some performing arts. That's where the brain starts to fire, and they see the creativity, and that gets then translated into the information age and into creativity. Arts and culture is part of building the next generation of great creators for all of our industries. But it wasn't always that way, and it wasn't always understood that way. And as a matter of fact, in much of Canada's history, arts and culture was sort of a side subject that wasn't talked, wasn't discussed at conferences like Prime Time and elsewhere. It was just sort of a side subject and was neglected. In June 1951, concerned about what was being seen in communities across this country, the Massey Commission, some of you are historians may know this, the Massey Commission did the first ever study in Canadian history on the fact of Canadian culture and what it meant and how we were doing. And the report was one of the most significant in Canadian history, was actually devastating about what the status of Canada's cultural communities and where they were. It outlined how Canada's culture was crumbling, slipping into foreign hands, and that there was indeed a crisis that needed to be addressed, and addressed quickly by the government. Among some of the findings of Massey's report, he found that the only true national publication in Canada from coast to coast was Reader's Digest, which was published entirely in the United States, entirely with American content. Because of the American dominance in the textbook publishing industry, American textbooks filled Canadian classrooms, and kids knew more about the 4th of July than the 1st of July, more about Abraham Lincoln and George Washington than Georges-Étienne Cartier and John A. Macdonald. Countless invaluable Canadian books could no longer be found inside Canada. In fact, the largest collection of Canadiana in the world was in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. The second largest collection was in the New York Public Library. The third largest collection of Canadian books was at Harvard University. The American Museum of Natural History had more full-time researchers in their insect and spider division than were researchers in the National Museum of Canada. At the National Gallery of Canada, which in the immediate post-war years had a permanent staff of 4 people. By comparison, at the exact same time, the Toledo Museum of Art in Ohio had 26 full-time employees. In 1948, there were over 1,800 original works of fiction that were published in Great Britain, 1,100 original works of fiction that were published in the United States. In Canada, there were 14. So we have come a very, very long way. And as we go into the future, we need to aggressively and proudly support our Canadian creators, our creative communities, and by doing so, we need to work together to modernize our policies and to do so in ways that will reflect and always protect Canadian culture and the excellence that we've built up over the years since that Massey report through until today. And we did so with the Canada Media Fund under our government. By merging together the CTF and the new Media Fund, establishing effective governance and strong partnerships, we have paved the way for great Canadian content on platforms that Canadians can choose. We also need to protect our artists with effective copyright reform. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the CMPA for your full support of our legislation, Bill C-32, the Copyright Modernization Act, because you understand how important this is for all of Canada. We consulted widely before we tabled this legislation. We listened to Canadians. And in this legislation, we think, the effective balance that will serve Canada for years to come. The legislation implements the international WIPO treaties. Bill C-32 will protect Canada's reputation on the international stage by raising our intellectual property protection to international standards and expectations. Our legislation also protects the rights of creators to protect themselves from hackers and thieves by allowing them to protect their own content by using digital locks if they choose. Bill C-32 makes piracy and theft illegal. It has a responsible expansion of fair dealing. It has a notice and notice regime that works. We require internet service providers to be part of the solution and enforcement. We support consumers by rejecting calls for increased taxes and levies on iPods and digital devices. And most importantly, in my view, this legislation forces a mandatory 5-year review of our intellectual property laws going forward so that no Parliament will ever be too scared of the politics of copyright reform to not tackle the necessity to have the best intellectual property regime that all Canadians deserve. So this legislation is essential. It's essential for our digital strategy, essential for creators, and it needs to be passed by this Parliament as soon as possible. So I've talked about some of what our government has done in the past. I've talked about what we're doing right now, and I want to talk a little bit about what's ahead. We must, as a government, and all of us together as partners, lean forward and aggressively move towards the era of digital transformation. Some great work has already been done. The National Film Board, and Tom Perlmutter is a real leader, has done great work in embracing digital media. Their iPhone and iPad apps are now legend and are outstanding success stories for all Canadians to follow, and institutions in particular. CBC Radio Canada has also done a fine job with 2.TV, CBC Radio, and Radio Canada apps that allow Canadians in all regions of the country to access all of CBC's library in both official languages when and where they choose. So you can have a Nova Scotian in British Columbia walking down Davie Street listening to music that's being broadcast out of Moose Jaw in French. This is what the CBC is supposed to be doing, embracing digital media, bringing Canadian content to Canadians in the language that they choose, where they choose, on the platform that they choose. This is the role of the CBC, and the CBC has embraced their responsibility to do so. And I think that they need to do more of that, because as we all know, everything is mobile now. It's no longer workstations and desktops. Everything is now mobile. As we all know from the social network, Facebook turns 7 this year. Foursquare turns 3 this year. YouTube turns 7. And Twitter has become such a powerful force that was almost nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for its role in the Green Revolution on the streets of Tehran not long ago. As producers, creators, and cultural business leaders, you all know that these platforms and challenges are out there, and they have to be embraced because of the unbelievable opportunity that they entail. And what I want to come today to tell you is that we too, as a government, and I, as Minister of Heritage, am absolutely enthusiastic, looking forward to, and embracing the challenges and opportunities that this digital media presents to us. In looking ahead, one of the things that we're doing right away is one of our first acts is to lift the freeze and end the freeze on co-production agreements. I announced at the Toronto International Film Festival that the first market that we're going to go after, and we've already started negotiations, is with India, the largest and most successful film producer in the world. We are already in the process of negotiating a co-production agreement with India. It's the first of many. And as we go forward, I'm going to be working with all of you and getting your feedback on what are the best markets for Canada to tackle, what should those agreements look like, and how will they best serve Canada, and how will they best serve Canada's cultural communities. But we want to create Canadian jobs through world sales, and break down these barriers, and make sure that the world market is the Canadian market. As Academy Award-nominated films Incendie and Barney's Version have shown, co-productions work. They work for the benefit of everybody. They work for the benefit of producers. They work for the benefit of the creative community. And they work for the benefit of audiences who want to consume as much content and talent as possible. And we need to have more of these kinds of agreements. And after 5 years, let me close where I began. After 5 years in government, Prime Minister Stephen Harper and our government, I think, have clearly shown that we value the importance of Canada's creative economy. Our investments in festivals, community events, the arts are unprecedented in Canadian history. We have 2 new national museums, of which we are incredibly proud. We are building new cultural spaces at a record pace. We have renewed our program support for creative communities for 5 years, protecting them all from the devastation of the recession as best we can. We're supporting and working with the CBC and Telefilm and NFB as they embrace new technology and move forward to make sure that the creative economy is well protected into the future with a digital strategy for all of them. And we are working to protect our creative industries with effective copyright reform in the House of Commons right now. We're also investing, as I said, records amount into the Canada Council for the Arts, and we are looking forward to a future where Canada's cultural industry will continue to stand tall and proud, not only in Canada, but indeed around the world. And when I mentioned Ava, when I mentioned Rick Mercer, when I mentioned what the cultural communities do for Canada, I want to make sure that all of you know, as producers, as creators, as people who have given your lives to the creation of content, I want to say thank you, and I want to make sure that you know that in me you have somebody who is a proud Canadian, proud of Canadian culture, proud of the Canadian arts, proud of everything that we can achieve together as long as we work together to ensure that Canada has the greatest cultural sector in the world. Thank you all very much.